I just about said good morning. Good evening, and good evening to those who are watching us online. We're glad you're able to do that, and we can provide that. Let's start with a song. What is our first song? Spirit of Gentleness and the Faith We Sing, 2120. Before we start looking at some of these other denominations, I just want to reiterate, because I know that saying something just once or twice or just putting it in writing once isn't always sufficient to communicate. And I just wanted to say that our last meeting that we had that was church-wide where we took a straw poll on our future was in the fall of 2019. This was after General Conference, after the traditionalist plan was put into place, as well as the exit plan to make it possible for churches that wanted to exit who don't agree with the current stance of the United Methodist Church to leave with their property. And there are some financial obligations, and the council has been in conversation with the leadership of our annual conference to find out what would Mosaic owe if we were to leave, say, today. Now, there's a process to leave. It doesn't happen in one day. It requires a vote of our church, and it would require a vote of the annual conference. And there's also a deadline, which is December the 31st of 2013. Now, when we took that vote in 2019, we thought that General Conference was going to be held the very next year. That was the next regularly scheduled General Conference. When COVID happened in March, that, of course, then was postponed until last year, 2020, and because, it was rescheduled to this year, and then it was rescheduled to this year, but it was canceled again, postponed because of COVID, and rescheduled for 2023. There has been no official word that it is happening for certain, no official word that it's being postponed. My best guess is that probably in January or February, I would say March at the very latest, but I think we'll hear by February if they're going to postpone it again, which would be due to COVID, because 40% of the delegates come from outside the United States. And I believe there's going to be issues with people not being vaccinated and people not being able to get visas, and maybe even, because I know there's countries right now that are saying, people can't just fly into our country. And so I just don't know what's going to happen. I would say that late spring, when people were getting vaccinated, all of us felt this huge relief, didn't we? And we thought life was going to be returning to normal. We started going to restaurants, movies even, and over the summer we realized that even with the variants, that having 2 shots was not just going to make us 100% safe. And so the world is topsy-turvy right now. I was at Panera in Edmond for a meeting this last week, and I walked up, and this big sign on the door said, if you've ordered online, if you're going to order at the kiosk, that's fine, and our chairs are open, and our tables are open, but there's no one at the registers to help you all day today. And I'm sure you've encountered that. I've gone to a restaurant and walked up, and it says, the drive-thru's open, but the dining room was not open. And so all of us are experiencing that. Went to Brahms the other night to get a shake, and they do not have their own cups. And they flat out said it's because of the supply chain issues. So I think just every single place we run into, I was at Sam's buying chips for our cookout that we're going to have a week from Sunday here at the church. There's a whole aisle that always has chips. And you never go to Sam's necessarily that there's anything empty, except when COVID first hit. And I was so shocked that the chips I normally buy were not there, and it was like there was like a quarter of the chips in that aisle. And I thought, this has to be because of COVID. It just has to be. So our world right now is topsy-turvy, and we just have to fully realize that. So I say that there are some people who are saying, oh yes, General Conference is going to happen next year. I would not bet on that. And I think that people say, why can't they do it online? Well, because 40% of our people come from overseas, and we're just not for sure if that's really feasible. And so I'm telling you that because once we know if General Conference is going to meet or not next year, I fully expect we will have a church-wide meeting, and we will give people plenty of notice for that meeting, because we will need to discuss at that point what our steps are going to be. Because if we're going to leave under the current exit plan, we will need to, I don't want to say pull the trigger. What's a better word for that? We'll need to initiate the sequence. We'll need to initiate the sequence. That's also a bad analogy. But we will need to initiate the process for leaving in the fall of 2022. And I think that would give us sufficient time to work without the details in the annual conference. And our primary decision will have to be that if General Conference isn't meeting, what do we do? Because if they do meet next year, then we can decide what to do after they meet. We'll be in a better position to know that they're going to meet, I think it's in August, it may be September in Minneapolis. So if they meet, then it still gives us plenty of time, because we'll have that whole fall to then have a church-wide meeting, and if we decide to leave, to engage, to start the process, okay? So I just want you to know there's no one making any decisions for this church. I want you to know that we don't talk about this every week, because there's nothing new to talk about in terms of what's happening with the general church. And I'm fully aware that we don't want to talk about this issue week in and week out, and our visitors don't want to necessarily hear us talking about this, although I think we should be honest with our visitors about our position. And we are very honest with if you look on our website, we're completely honest about what our denomination says, what we say, and the stance we've taken. So we're not hiding anything or doing anything like that. But I think that if people think, well, some of the church is making decisions, no, we're not. And it seemed to me that this was the right time to talk about different denominations and different options. Many of you were fully aware that Jenny and I took this class in January of 2020. Part of our assignment at the very end was to put together a 5-week course. That's exactly why I did a 5-week course on the UCC, because that is the denomination that on a personal level, if I'm going to leave the Methodist Church and join another denomination, that's my number one option. Now, that may not be the number one option for you. It may not be the number one option for Mosaic. That decision will be made through the conversations that we have as a congregation, okay? And those conversations, those votes are not taking place yet, and nor will they take place until we announce that's exactly why we're meeting, and you'll have plenty of time to know that and plenty of time to prepare for that. So, having said all of that, we did take 5 weeks to talk about the UCC, and then we had an additional week where last week, Lori Walkie and Lisa Wolf came and talked to us about their perspectives of the UCC, both being ordained ministers in that denomination. All of those videos are on our YouTube channel. Tonight I want to briefly talk about 4 of what is called the mainline denominations. That is not being fair to them, because that's giving them about 10 minutes or so each, but I want to highlight what I think are the most significant things that I think that we as Mosaic would first look at in terms of thinking of these denominations. Now, what I did put on the very first page of the packet, did everybody get a packet? Alan, do you mind grabbing some, or somebody grab? Jonathan will do that. So on the first sheet, let's just briefly say, here's where the United Methodist Church is on some of these issues. So it was founded in the 1700s, and there's been various splits and mergers, but in 1968, the United Methodist Church officially came into being. Our theology is strongly rooted in grace. It is also strongly rooted in free will, although we may not talk much about that. We are Wesleyan Arminian. Arminian coming from Jacob Arminius, who really stressed the idea of free will, which was opposed to the idea of predestination or determinism. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We are probably the most progressive, the most liberal of all the Methodist groups out there. There's 80 million Methodists around the globe. There's about 13 million United Methodists. So there's actually more outside the United Methodist Church, but we are the largest denomination. I would say there's none of them that are more liberal or more progressive than we are. Who are some of our conservative siblings? Well, the Free Methodists, the Wesleyans, and then possibly the Nazarenes. There's a little bit of iffiness in terms of if we talk about are they directly from us or not, but they do trace their history directly to Wesley and share with us much of the same foundational theological and doctrinal documents. And so they're very similar to us. As far as creeds, we always say we're not a creedal church, but I don't know what that means, because when we baptize, the Apostles' Creed is part of our ritual, which technically is required. In our hymnal, you will find at the back the Nicene Creed, which is a very historic creed. Other creeds, some of them are very contemporary. I love the creed from the United Church of Canada, for example, that I grew up saying about every other Sunday that we weren't saying the Apostles' Creed. The EUB is one of our denominations that joined with us in 1968. They had what they called the Confession of Faith. They were very Methodist also in their orientation. They were mostly German-speaking in the beginning. That's why we merged with them, because they were very similar to us, and their confession of faith, our articles of religion, are basically said to be equal. Our articles of religion are 25 articles that came from the 39 articles of the Church of England, because John Wesley was a priest in the Church of England. But having said that, I think what this means is that we really don't require people who are joining our church to subscribe to a certain creed per se. However, in our ritual, the Apostles' Creed is there in the baptismal ritual. So that's something that's not for discussion tonight, but that's a very interesting discussion. What does it mean to say we're creedal or not creedal? Baptism, we all know that we baptize people of any age, of any mode, meaning sprinkling, pouring, or immersion. We're probably well aware that our form of government, let me just say, we are a representative government like our United States government. That means that you elect people to represent you, like, for example, on the council. And the council votes on things that every member in the church does not get to vote on. So unlike our Baptist siblings, where every member has a vote at a church meeting, Methodists are representative. And you send me, well, you don't really send me, I'm a member of the annual conference, but you also have elected a lay person. Eric Brown is our lay person, who is the lay member of the conference. And he is there on behalf of Mosaic. But what I really wanted to point out in that also is that we have a trust clause. It is not unique to United Methodist, but it means that we own the property, but we hold it in trust for the denomination. What that means also practically is if we want to build, we have to get permission. If we want to move, we have to get permission. And we just can't do anything we want with the property. It's a matter of working through the hierarchy to get that approved. I just flat out said, when it comes to LGBTQ persons, we're non-affirming. Now, we say all people are people of sacred worth. But we're not affirming when it comes to marriage. We're not affirming when it comes to pastors who are in a marriage relationship. Worship. You know we have a lot of freedom in our worship. If you look in the front of the hymnal, we have a word and table pattern that has been put together really post-1960s, really post-Vatican II. And Vatican II redid a lot of things with Catholic worship, and a lot of Protestants began to look at the same documents, the same historical documents that the Catholics were looking at. And across the board, really, a lot of denominations have this basic pattern. It's the pattern that actually we use at Mosaic. We gather, we hear the word, we respond to the word, in prayer, in the offering, we have communion, we're sent out. That is the basic pattern. You can see there our website. I'm not going to read everything else. The things I have on here after that are the things that are on our website. We have a page on our website that says, we're United Methodists. These are the things that I think are the most important things about United Methodists that we could put out there for the public to see. And what I did not put on here is our idea of being a progressive church, and that's on our website as well, but that's not what I put on here. So that's a very quick overview of United Methodism. The next page is UCC, skip that page, and the next page is the Disciples of Christ. Skip that page because we'll come back to that next week. Next week we'll take the whole hour to talk about the disciples. Paul Culkin was a pastor in the Disciples before he switched to being United Methodist. And then we will have the director of the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, who is also an ordained disciples minister, come. So they will both talk to us next week about the disciples. All right, look at the next page. The ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I probably know the least, I know the least about this group and the American Baptist. I have been to an ELCA church in seminary. Maybe I attended twice. Other than that, there hasn't tended to be a lot of Lutherans in Oklahoma, except in many areas we do have what's the conservative group the Missouri Synod. I don't know if there's more of those in Oklahoma, but I do know, especially up around Enid, and then when I was in Lone Wolf, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was the largest church in town. And so, but they were also a very open church, and we actually did a lot of things together. So the Lutheran Church was really the first church that formed to split off of the Catholic Church in Europe. In the 1500s, various splits, many denominations. In 1988, the current configuration of the ELC was started, and their theology is Lutheran, and I put /Protestant. Lutherans emphasize grace, but they also talk a lot about the law and grace, and that's a whole discussion they have. They talk about being saved by grace through faith. And their conservative siblings there, the Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, and others, if we were to do a study of Lutherans, then we would look at what they have called the Book of Concord. And they have confessions that we don't share with them, such as the Augsburg Confession. So we would really need to look at that confession to say, what is in that confession that makes Lutherans sort of unique that maybe Methodists don't necessarily buy into? Now, when they have communion, they have the Nicene Creed. So when we have communion, we're not required to say the Nicene Creed. I actually know very few Methodist churches that say the Nicene Creed on any kind of regular basis. Possibly a church might say it once a year. If we were Catholic, if we were Lutheran, if we were Episcopalian, we would be saying the Nicene Creed every time we have communion, because that's part of what those traditions do. Baptism, the same as Methodist. Any age, all modes. But I would say that sprinkling tends to be the mode that Methodists talk about. Other denominations typically talk about pouring and immersion, okay? Form of government. This is straight off of either their website or perhaps Wikipedia, and I think Wikipedia is probably accurate about 90% of the time. There may be some nuances in Wikipedia that aren't accurate, but people tend to really edit those, and people who know, they tend to keep those things fairly accurate. Their form of government. Most local congregations are legally independent nonprofit corporations within the state. They own their own property. Governing practice within the congregation ranges from congregational voters, or maybe special congregational meetings, or an elder and a council led, to maybe congregations where the senior pastor wields great, if informal, power. Okay, so there's a lot of... Now, so what we would need to do is really have a Lutheran pastor here and a Lutheran layperson and say, tell us how this really works, right? But I think, generally speaking, they might be about the same as us, maybe, in how the local church is run. According to wherever I found this, they do own their own property, and I am not for sure if I could find how they actually get their pastors. So I do not know because they have bishops as well, and I do not know if the local church hires their own pastors, or my guess is if they have a say in it, it's probably like how the UCC talked about last week. They probably are vetted by denominational entities. There may be a pool of people, but I do not know the intricate details of how that works. The ALCA is LGBTQ affirming. That does not mean every church and every Lutheran person is affirming. Their worship style, I would say, is probably a little bit more formal than Mosaic. The ones that I've tended to go to tend to stick to a very, I don't want to say rigid structure, but maybe a set structure. And some of us might even think this feels a little Catholic, or it might be similar to an Episcopal church. Now, I do think there may be some freedom, and I think there's probably some Lutheran churches that have contemporary services that wouldn't really feel like a Catholic service at all. But most of the churches, when I've gone to a Lutheran church, they tend to have a lot of liturgy, which we have some liturgy, which right now we're not doing a lot of that, because I'm trying to keep people from speaking a lot in the service with our mask on and whatnot. But I just think that we might think, this feels a little Catholic, perhaps, okay? And you can see that their website's listed there. Everything on this page came off their website. Does anybody here have any experience with the Lutherans? Anything you want to share with us? Or if I said this pretty accurately?
Fairly accurately, yes. I was a long time ago though, but they called their pastors through the church.
Okay.
At that time. I don't know if the pastor at the council did it, or I can't remember if they did it or the church had one on it. But anyway, they called them from a group of people, and then they had interviews, and they selected who they wanted.
Okay. That's kind of what I suspected.
In moving to Norman, I did some research on progressive congregations, and the Evangelical Lutherans were one of the congregations I searched. What I found was that it feels very Episcopalian in terms of their governance and in terms of their understanding of faith, a very conservative Episcopal understanding. The language is not something that we would have used within the last 10 years.
I think I shared with you all, I don't know if it was on a Wednesday night or not, but there's a Lutheran church near where I grew up, and so I drive by it all the time. It's on the main road, how we get out of my parents' neighborhood into town, and I never knew what kind of Lutheran church it was. But this last year, like at Christmas, I thought, I want to know more about that church. Well, it was a Missouri Synod church, and on their website, the top thing said, we believe in a literal 6-day, 24-hour, 7-day week creation. And that was like in big, bold letters. And I just thought, nope, I don't care if you believe in that, and I don't disrespect you if you believe in that, but if you're going to make that be the cornerstone of your church, and then obviously everybody's going to have to agree with that, right, to some degree, I just thought, that's not where I am. And that just shocked me because I thought, I think Jesus and faith and grace, the love of God, might be the first thing, huh? That might be number one, not creationism. Yeah, so I was now that was not the ELCA church. That's it. But anybody else? Let me give you the mic, Jerry.
I know that with the ELCA, the United Methodist Church a few years ago announced a joint reunion. And I don't know if it's true for any others, but would that affect the ease with which we might make a transition toward any other denomination?
Yeah, so in the 20th century, and I've mentioned this before, many denominations began to talk more about working together, and there's been various, at first there were discussions of kind of like how we might even, I don't want to speak out of turn. At first, it may have been more about mergers, but then it quickly became about, well, we don't really want to merge, but how can we be more united? And so there are organizations that are still work on that. I would say in the past 20 to 30 years, some of that's kind of gone by the wayside. I think part of that is because as denominations are shrinking, they become inward focused, and they're trying to save themselves, right? And so some denominations have made official agreements with each other, just like how our speakers last week said that the UCC and the disciples have this agreement, so that their missions is one organization. They don't have two separate ones that just work together. They really only have one missions agency that represent both churches, and they work together. And then, as they said last week, their pastors can easily switch between churches because of that agreement where you recognize on a formal level that you recognize each other's ordinations, right? So denominations also are in conversations with each other. The Methodists have been talking to the Catholics for, 4 or 5 decades. And so every once in a while, we'll see an article about that, and then they may put out a paper, and they want you to read that paper, right, and talk about it. So what Jerry's saying is that we actually, I think, are in a ecumenical relationship with the ELCA. Now, we're in conversation with other denominations, I think, but we've made that official. Now, the funny thing about that is, I'm sure the documents say this, that we should have a hamburger cookout with the nearest Lutheran church, right? That we should come together for a hymn sing. I'm absolutely certain that it says that. It probably even says now that we should then have a worship together and celebrate communion together. I always say that really hasn't trickled down like to local churches. Because I've been doing this since 95, and I've never heard anybody in Oklahoma talking about that. And so, that's one of those weird kind of things. Now, it might mean that we could switch to Lutheran pretty easily. I don't know that for a fact. But if we recognize our ordinations, that certainly would make it probably easier for me. I don't know. I don't know what more education I'd have to do, but that's certainly, I hadn't really thought about that, but you're exactly right. We're in conversations with the Episcopalians as well. So let me just switch to them. Because around the same time, all these denominations sort of started at the same time. 1500s, 1600s. And the Episcopalians, that's the name for the Anglicans in the United States. But the Church of England began, and this is really murky, but King Henry VIII basically wanted an annulment, and the Pope said no, and King Henry VIII basically said, well, I'm going to just be the head of the church in England. Now, he didn't start the Church of England. I think that he considered himself Catholic, and he died considering himself Catholic, but he sort of also said, to heck with the Pope, and I don't know all the details of that because I've long since forgotten my high school history, but what would happen is when he died, and then there might be a king or queen that really did think they were Catholic, and then they would swing the country in a certain direction. The next king or queen would come along and say, no, we're not going to be Catholic. Yvonne can probably really give me the details of this. But then the country would swing in the other direction. And it really was during the time of Elizabeth I, and she was one of the heirs. She was a daughter, right, of King Henry VIII, I think. And during her time, and she was not the sole responsible person, there were others and people in the church, and it really became known that they were going to, this is how their church was going to look and feel. And their worship is not exactly like the Catholic Church, but I guarantee you if we go there, we would feel like that, right? We would feel it. We would think, whoa, they're not Methodist. And we would think that, even though John Wesley was a Church of England priest. And in all honesty, he sent to us in the U.S., when the Methodist Church started, in the late 1800s, how he thought we should worship. And if we had followed that to the T, we probably would feel a lot more like the Church of England or the Episcopal Church right across over here at St. John's. But, we Americans don't do anything we're told to do, right? But there also was like this movement that swept across our nation at various times with a lot of revivalism and singing gospel songs and a lot of freedom and kind of moving away from a more rigid structure. And so today you will find Methodists who really, really want to swing back to that more high church feel. And then there's Methodists that could care less about that. And sometimes you'll hear people say, I want to go to a traditional church. Well, sometimes what that really means is the church that looks like what I grew up with. That may not mean high church, but it could mean, those things are all so subjective. But we have been in conversations with the Episcopalians as well. If 2016 or 19, that general conference had not happened, and COVID hadn't happened, we might already have an official relationship with the Episcopalians, because it had already been approved by us or them, and then the other denomination had to approve it. But when we had the traditionalist plan, and we thought there's going to be a church split, everybody said, this has got to be put on hold. So it's on hold, and of course, COVID happened. But again, we could find documents that would say we should be studying together, eating hamburgers together, to get to know each other better, doing ice angels together, right? And even coming around and having services together, but that doesn't always trickle down. It just doesn't. And I don't know why, but it just doesn't. So the Church of England, I think that, where did I put them? They talk about the via media, the middle way. There are times when they feel more Catholic, there's times when they feel more Protestant, and they try to hold that tension together. And just like you go to 10 Methodist churches, you're going to experience 10 different kinds of worship. You might go to an Episcopal church that really is formal and what we call high church. But you might go to a church that's more loose and more down to earth and more, not so rigid, I guess, okay? But even with those two extremes, they follow their Book of Common Prayer. There's not a lot of leeway into, so when I was doing an internship in seminary, it was at an Episcopal church. Like I said, they say the Nicene Creed every time there's communion. But because I was doing an internship, I moved from the pews up to the platform, whatever they call it, up there, one time next to the priest, and while we were saying the Nicene Creed, there's a word in there that says, Jesus was he became man. I can't remember what else it said, but it says he became man. Well, in our hymnal, we have, he became human. See the difference? And the priest, I noticed, said, and he became, and then her mouth shut. So afterwards I said, I noticed you didn't say man. And she said, well, I don't, that's very exclusive, and that's very patriarchal, and blah, 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 blah. And I remember saying, that's why I'm glad I'm a Methodist, because we can just say human. Right? But see, somebody's made that change, and as you can imagine, some people don't like tinkering, right, with those documents from thousands of years ago, right? Now, for Methodists, changing that to human, that's really probably no big deal, even among the most conservative Methodists. But those are fighting words, or can be, to people like Episcopalians or Catholics, right? So that's just giving you an example, though, of how they stick to those words. And if they want to use like a new version of the communion prayer, because they do put out new versions occasionally, they got to get permission from their bishop to actually do that in their church, even if it's their denomination which has made those available. So it's a little bit more structure and, I would say, rigidness, a little bit more hierarchy also. So they have the Articles of Religion, which is more than what we have. Say the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed. Baptism, same as us. Form of government, well, I think they have the same kind of trust clause kind of thing. They may not have the trust clause, but for the past decade, they've been fighting as churches have said, we want to leave, and they're getting sued by the denomination who says you can't take the property. And local churches have sued back, right, countersued. They've spent millions in lawsuits. That's what the Methodists want to try to avoid. That is why in St. Louis we said, let's make a gracious exit so that people could leave without going to court and spending millions of dollars. Just pay your pension obligation, okay? And so there are some property issues. They are LGBTQ affirming. Those who are not have primarily left and formed other Anglican churches. We've got several of those in the Oklahoma City area, in fact. Their worship style, the order is just like ours, but it would feel very differently because they do a lot of things that we don't do and a lot of things that they would require that we don't require. So if you go into an Episcopal church, I think 90% of them they go to a knee before they get into the pew. You say, doesn't Catholics do that? Yes, so do a lot of Episcopalians. That probably isn't required, but you will see 75% or 90% of people doing that. Crossing themselves, and then the words used. The words, they're in that book, That's what they pray. It's what holds them together, okay? You can read here about things I took right off the website of the Episcopal Church. So anybody have experience with the Episcopal Church? Yvonne, do you want to say anything? Here, let me bring you the mic.
Mine was the Church of England. Actually,
Right.
it was the Church of England in East Africa mostly.
Okay.
And it did have pretty strict rules about things. We had kneeling benches. But we always knew when people came in and did the, going on the knees or crossing themselves, we'd sort of nudge each other and say, church.
High church.
And we regarded most of our churches in East Africa as broad church.
What does broad church mean?
Well,
Not as high church? Or?
It's not as, as formal. It doesn't do all the little
Okay.
things. But going to England for my father's funeral, he was buried by the local church because in England the church is part government, part. And so we went to their service and they were having a Latin mass. So that was high church.
That's high church, yeah. Yeah. Carl, I'll come to you, but anybody else over here? Do what? What?
The grape juice tastes different.
They don't use grape juice.
Mark and I were in the Episcopal Church for 2 years back in the Dark Ages. I come away from the Episcopal Church with the following feeling, that they're an Oreo. They have the center, which is the congregation and the people, and you can't ask for any more open, honest, and committed community. But it is encased in that Book of Common Prayer. And the values of the people cannot always come through because of the restrictions of that Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah, let me add to that. So the Episcopalians in the U.S., because every country sometimes has their own version of that book, they have actually 2 different versions of their Sunday morning service. And one is called Rite 1, R-I-T-I, right, meaning like a ritual, right? That is more traditional and what I would say is old school, and uses language that comes straight out of the 1600s, right? That's what we call Elizabethan English, right? You can understand it. It's not like Shakespeare, but it gets pretty close. And so if you think about like the King James Bible, it kind of has that feel, but maybe not quite like that. But there are words that'll pop up, and you're like, I have no idea what that word means, right? And what Carl says is true is that I think that particular version is really traditional in its theological understandings, right? So the Rite 2 is the newer ones that have been written since the 1970s, right? So, and the priests and the church can pick between about 4 or 5 different communion prayers, right? But that uses contemporary language, at least for the 70s. And so, for example, you're also going to find a lot of father language, even in Rite 2. And you're going to find probably things like sisters and brothers, and even more inclusive things like how we might say siblings to be even more inclusive, right? I think there's a movement that many say it's time to update even that. But change happens very slowly in the Church of England or the Anglican or the Episcopal Church. So in Rite 2, they've actually worded things in such a way, I believe, that different people with different beliefs can kind of find themselves in those words. And I said this before to this group. And in their baptismal ritual, you kind of find the same thing, where they don't come right out and say, this is what we believe, but it's written in a way that if you're a little bit more over here or you're a little bit over here, you can find common ground in those words. And I think it's really remarkable myself. But if you listen to the right one, you might think, whoa, this is really old school and really stuck in an historical context. Because in different times in history, the church emphasizes different things. So, for example, if we had our old hymnals here, and you were to read the communion ritual, as Methodists, it's very much, woe is me, I'm a sinner, and I'm going to have to grovel at the feet of God. Because at one point in history, that was sort of the emphasis. And Jesus' death on the cross, that was all about a sacrifice made for us and that we're saved by the blood, right, that flowed from his body. But if you read the new liturgy, if you read in our hymnal, the emphasis went from, woe is me, I'm a dirty, rotten sinner, to really a sense of celebration and giving thanks to God for the goodness of God, for the goodness of the world, for the goodness of us. And yes, it acknowledges in there that we've blown it as people, but God still loves us. And Jesus comes along and Jesus helps us. And so the emphasis is really different. But it's also why every church I've gone to, because we're people, we're creatures of habit. A lot of our music, our musicians, they tend to play during communion slow songs. And songs you might hear at a funeral home. And songs that sort of talk about the death of Jesus, right? And I've always gone in and said, please play happy songs, because this is not just, you may focus in your life at a particular moment on your need of God's grace. You may say, I need to get forgiveness. But that's not the only thing communion's about. So let's also have a celebration. One time in Ponca, I played Happy by Farrell. That jolted people because that was a completely different atmosphere. But I'll never forget, in seminary once, we were in line coming up for communion, and the dean of the chapel made his way through the line, hugging people and talking to people. You see, most of us probably think, shh, it's communion, right? You don't talk. It's somber, right? And he created this atmosphere of a party. That was like when the light bulb went on for me, and I was like, oh, communion can be done in many different ways. When we have communion during Lent, it should feel different than when we have communion on Easter Sunday. If communion on Easter Sunday feels like Good Friday, we're doing communion absolutely wrong. That's my opinion, okay? But most of us have grown up, myself included, with communion kind of being one way. And it's hard for people to break free of that. And so, back to the Episcopalians. Some people like that old language. They like tradition. That's like what they grew up with. So they have that. They also have a contemporary language. But if we were to look at it, we might say it's not contemporary enough for Mosaic. And I'd be happy to look at that more and talk more about that. In fact, if you want, we can invite a Lutheran, we can invite an Episcopalian, we could do that. I will say this, I want to move off of Wednesday nights after next week, though. What I want to do is go back to having this really be a worship experience, not just a kind of class or a lecture. So if we want to study more, we can do that, but let's take a little bit of a break, and let's figure out how to do that maybe at some other time, okay? But any other questions, though, about Episcopalians? So let's go to Presbyterians. Presbyterians were influenced by a man named John Calvin, 1500s in Europe. But what he emphasized was God's sovereignty. God is in control. God controls everything. And at various times in history, also, the church sometimes swings from this idea that God controls everything to having more free will, right? And so the Presbyterians and the Methodists have always been at odds over this. But in modern times that we're living in, most of us don't think about this. We're not walking out of here saying, we don't like the Presbyterians. They're not walking out of their church saying, we don't like the Methodists. But people who know this history and know theology know that there is a little bit of a dividing line. And so I put in here, from their website, what they said about predestination. It's on the back of that purple sheet. So, I took philosophy. It was required in seminary, a semester of philosophy. And my first paper was over a statement from the Presbyterians and the Westminster Confession of Faith. And that statement basically said, God, because God is all-powerful, has saved some people for heaven. And God has damned other people to hell. And I had to write a paper about that. That's the key idea that Methodists say, oh, we don't believe that at all. What do we believe? We believe that God offers all people the chance to have new life in Jesus Christ. And if you want to bring heaven into that, that's just fine and dandy. But God loves us so much that God says, now I want you to choose to follow me. Now, Methodists would say it is God's grace which reaches out to us and helps us. That God does woo us. You know, woo, W-O-O, like Tony did to Maggie when he fell in love with her. He called her, took her to dinner, right? Brought her flowers. Huh? And she knitted him an afghan. But you know, God is reaching out to us as well. But God also, we say, wants us to freely choose. Now, if you think about it and lay in bed at night, you may think, well, did I choose or did I not even have a choice? So that gets into a lot of things that most of us don't really think about, right? Listen to what they said on their website. Predestination is the teaching to which some Christians have adhered, including John Calvin. Calvin argued from Scripture that God has predestined or elected some people to be saved in Jesus Christ and others not to be. So if I was in a small town and the only church that was there was a Presbyterian church, I could go there. I'm not for sure, though, if I could become a pastor there, because I have issue with that. He insisted, nonetheless, that we could be sure only of our own salvation. We were never in a position to judge whether or not another person was saved. For Calvin, the point of the doctrine of predestination was to remind us that God is free and gracious. There is nothing that we can do to earn God's favor. Rather, our salvation comes from God alone. We are able to choose God because God first chose us. Properly understood, the doctrine of predestination frees us from speculating about who is saved and who is not. God has already taken care of these matters in the mystery of God's own being. We are called to hear God's good news for the preaching of the gospel to be heard, to be believed. It is to be held as beyond doubt that if you believe and are in Christ, you are elected. So now we can get into a lot of debates about a lot of this. And I will guarantee you that none of you are going home tonight saying, I'm a Methodist and I have been entirely sanctified. But that is a key part of our Methodist history. And if we don't want to talk about entire sanctification, we can talk about what it means to be perfect, which every pastor who's ordained is asked, are you going on to perfection? And do you expect to be made perfect in love in this life? And just like you're not going home asking yourselves those questions, there's probably not any Presbyterians going home who are in the PCUSA thinking to themselves, I wonder if God has really chosen me for heaven or if I'm damned to go to hell. So, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time, if I were to have to be tested to be a Presbyterian pastor, I probably wouldn't make it, nor would I want to make it. I'm just being completely honest. And I have Presbyterian friends, so I'm not dissing them. They also diss me, so, It is what it is. And if we talk to a Presbyterian pastor, they would also talk to us about the nuances of all of this. But I'm just saying this was flat out what was on, their website. But if you look at the Methodist website and you look at the EUB Confession of Faith, which is considered one of our doctrinal standards, it talks about entire sanctification. So, anybody here Presbyterian? I do know we have some people in our church who, and Jonathan has Presbyterian roots, so. American Baptists, I know the least about the American Baptists. We tend to think of Baptists as all being the same, but we know they're not. Southern Baptists are the biggest denomination that's Protestant. Okay, Methodists, we're right behind them. But there's the Free Will Baptist, there's all kinds of Baptists. And these are the Northern Baptists who really weren't a part of the Southern Baptist Convention, okay? Southern Baptists have a lot of repenting to do, just like we do, over the issue of slavery and how we've treated people. But the American Baptists were founded in the 1600s. According to their website, they talk about the individual's sole competency and responsibility before God and in church autonomy, which is exactly what Southern Baptists talk about as well. Each local church is autonomous. You have to be old enough to choose to be baptized by immersion. There are no creeds. Baptists are really against creeds. Government control, local. They're not really affirming as a denomination. They say we leave it up to the local church. That's important for me to make that distinction. With worship, local control. These facts about American Baptists came right off of their website. If there was an American Baptist church across the street, I am convinced we could probably do things with them. In my heart of hearts, I'm not really a Baptist. Primarily, I'm just not. But baptism of people of any age is important to me. So it might be hard for me to join a denomination which says, baptism of babies is wrong. Now, some of the denominations we've talked about, like the disciples, they may say, we want people to be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and be immersed. But if you were baptized as a baby and sprinkled, we will accept that. But some denominations, like many Southern Baptists, would say, no, you've got to be immersed. If you've not been immersed and you were baptized as a baby, you really weren't even baptized. So that's where we get into some sticky, situations. Are you going to say something? Okay, here, let me.
The governance of Baptists, of the American Baptist, it's up to the local congregation.
I think so, yes.
Is this not the same language of the UCC?
Yes. And I want to say about the Episcopalians, I think they've got a lot of control who becomes their priest, but they kind of have to, I think, get that signed off by the powers that be, I think. I think the Presbyterians are the same way. If you're Presbyterian, you have to be in good standing in the region. And so if we were Presbyterian and we find somebody in Iowa and want to bring them here to Oklahoma City, they've got to be approved by the hierarchy, and then we could hire them if we were Presbyterian. Anybody else have any association or any questions now or any comments? I have way oversimplified a lot of this. But I think I've keyed in on what I consider to be key points that I think are fairly accurate. I've not tried to paint anybody in a bad light. But I've tried to think of things that we would be asking as Mosaic. Who picks the pastor? Who owns the property? Are they LGBTQ affirming? How are decisions made? What's the worship like? If we became Episcopalian, our worship would have to look different. So each denomination is going to have a different kind of expectation on us. in terms of how our church is governed and how we worship. So a key for me has been that the UCC, and I'm going to really guess 99%, I'm sure, that the disciples as well, are going to have the least restrictions to place on a new church coming into their denominations. They told us that last week. Our council knows that about the UCC. The thing about disciples is they do say, well, we baptize. Now, they also have a lot of local control. So I asked a friend of mine, I said, well, what if we join the disciples and we said, we're going to baptize babies? He said, well, no one can tell you not to do that, but I will guarantee you they're going to look at you with the side eye. So, baptism. They also have disciples, as we can hear next week, they celebrate the Lord's Supper every single week. Now, the way that looks might feel different than how we do it. I don't know, though, if they would come in and say, like, well, you must do it exactly the way we do it. I know when I was growing up, they had it before the sermon. And lay people who are considered elders or deacons come up and pray the prayer. Usually it's two people. One person prays over the bread, one person prays over the cup. Then they have people that serve, and they pass the plates in the pews. Now, there may be different ways they do it now. That's definitely the traditional way they do it. Some churches now do it after the sermon, but I think for the majority of their history, they did it before the sermon. And we can get into all kinds of theological reasons of why we do things the way we do them. Any questions or comments? So there are denominations we've not looked at. There's the Reformed Church of America. There's the Moravian Church. There's the Unitarian Church. What I need, and what the council probably needs, is that if somebody were to feel really strongly, like, let's talk about this, bring it up, because we will talk about it. But we're not going to talk about it if nobody brings it up, then we're probably going to talk about it. What about just becoming independent? Well, we could do that. There's a lot of issues with that, because the denomination gives you legal covering. That doesn't exist if you're independent. And so, for example, our tax-exempt status is under the umbrella of the United Methodist Church. And as a pastor, I have certain protections because I'm a part of the denomination as well. And when you're independent, that all goes away. But we could talk about that if that's what you really want to do. Anything you want to bring up? Carl, and then I'll come to Martha.
The Episcopalians decided to ordain homosexuals. Those that split off became part of another diocese.
Yeah, I think it's called, yeah, go ahead.
Have we looked into the possibility of us affiliating with the Methodist Church?
Okay, so the question also is, what about the Methodist Church in Great Britain? Like, could we associate with them? I have seen on Facebook in some groups talk about that. I don't think anybody's taking it to any kind of serious level yet, but I've seen people mention that. Now, the other thing is that there is a progressive group that started what they called the Liberation Methodist Connection. And their ideal is sort of to be a new progressive Methodist denomination, but they also talk about it not necessarily being a denomination. That seems very mushy to me, and I don't think they're really organized yet. They've got some stuff out there. They've got a website, but they're not really functioning as a denomination. So that's also another thing that's out there. Another thing that's been asked is, could we associate with, say, the Western jurisdiction? That's also been a question, and many people are talking about when General Conference does meet, maybe there will be splits that would allow us to cross those kind of boundaries. So, Martha?
I was just wondering if you think that if, say, that General Conference does get postponed, will the deadline for leaving also get changed?
I believe it will, because the deadline currently is in stone, and if General Conference doesn't meet, then they can't undo that or put in a new date. Now, what could happen, but this is depending, how much do you want to gamble? They could have a different exit plan again. That's a gamble, right? So what's happened is that many people, since it's been called off, there's a lot of different opinions about what should happen. So on the conservative side, people are generally determined either they're going to stay or they're going to leave and be a part of this new denomination. On the more liberal side, there's a lot more opinions. I mean, it's just a mess. And one of those opinions is not really wanting to divide the church. I mean, it's just really, it's a mess. It's just a mess. So and I'm saying everybody's not happy with there being an exit plan to begin with, in all honesty. So who else raised their hand? So if we wanted to get that started, we would need to start that in the fall of next year, because there's a lot of things we need to do, steps to take, and if annual conference were to meet in the end of May or the beginning of June of 23, then we would have to be prepared for that vote to take place at annual conference in the spring of 23. Because if we miss that, and we said to the annual conference, well, we want to leave, can you have a special annual conference like in the fall? They might say, we're not going to do that for one church. So, Jerry.
A few years ago, I did a little project to see if I could find out how many Christian denominations and groups there were.
Yep.
And now I understand why the answer was 34,000.
You know, even on the Catholic side, there are splits from the Catholic Church that do exist. And there are Catholic churches that have a female priest. They're not a part of the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope, what's his name? Francis, thank you. But we don't hear about them, but they are out there. And so there's 34,000. That's just absolutely crazy. I want to say something that I said 2 weeks ago, and I know I'm running out of time. Okay? There is the chance that we could say, let's become a federated church. What is a federated church? It's one church that relates to two or more denominations. So we could become a church that relates to the United Methodist Church and whatever other church we want to relate to. For the sake of argument, let's just say it's UCC. So that is a possibility. And everybody who's a member of the church could then say, put my name on the Methodist roll or put my name on the UCC roll, or you could say, I don't want to be on either roll, just put my name on the Mosaic roll. And every new person that joins, you would just ask them, what roll do you want to be on? And you say, what does that really mean in the end? Well, it means we would have one foot in both churches. So we could still try to have a positive influence on the Methodists, but we would not be as closely tied to them necessarily. We would not have to pay 100% apportionments like we do now. Our apportionments would probably be less. We would also have a foot in whatever other denomination we join. And for most people, that isn't going to matter. And for some of our people, like I thought about this. Our Methodist women may want to stay as Methodist women. And I thought, even if we leave the Methodist Church, I wonder if the Methodist Women Organization would say, you can have United Methodist Women at your church even though you're not Methodist. But if we were federated, then that wouldn't even be a question. We could still have Methodist women, right? As a federated church, we would want the property to probably not be in the Methodist name, and we can make that happen. Then we could have weddings, but also if we became federated, the local church would decide the form of government that you want to do, which I would say it would make sense to continue doing what we're doing. But then we could also decide how we want to get a pastor. Some churches who are federated say every other time the pastor must come from a different denomination that represents us. And that's really kind of the old way of doing it. But the newer way also could be each time we need a pastor, we will decide how we want to do that. So that means that if there comes the day that the Methodist Church changes their rules on LGBT equality, then the Mosaic might freely say, well, yes, this time we want a Methodist pastor. But if you feared you may not get a pastor that was affirming, you might just say, well, we're going to go with a UCC pastor or whatever. And that's the power of a federated church. There are many federated churches across our nation. There's one in Kingfisher, one in Weatherford. There's also one right up here on 63rd Street. So they're not really that necessarily well known, but they are out there. So that's something the council is looking at. And before we would ever decide that, we're going to bring all this to a church-wide meeting or meetings to everyone. I trust that our council is not going to vote on these huge issues without knowing exactly where the people in the pews stand. So I think you can be really confident of that. As long as I'm the pastor, I will advocate for that. So we're not going to make any decisions behind closed doors without you guys knowing.
If you're federated, how do you get a pastor?
Well, every local church, I think, decides that on their own. Now, a federated church that has a Methodist they might say, when this pastor leaves, we're going to go with the Methodist pastor. And when that Methodist pastor leaves, we're going to go with the other pastor. And some churches have more than two denominations. I think that's an old way of doing it, to be fair. But I think some churches now say, we're not going to box ourselves in. Each time we need a pastor, we'll discern which way should we go. So
I'm just wondering, though, if this federated church, if the pastor, as part of the Methodist connection, still would be under prohibitions.
I believe the pastor would. And so Helen raises the issue, would a Methodist pastor still be under the prohibitions? The answer is yes. And there's two prohibitions, that a pastor can't do a same-sex wedding, but also we have a prohibition that says a same-sex wedding cannot take place on church property. So there's a church in Texas that's considering doing this. And I've seen their documents that they've put out to their church. And they're wanting to keep their property in the Methodist name. So my first thought was, why do they want to do that? Because they're not going to be able to have weddings. But they state in their document that they're going to get, if they have a Methodist pastor, you can still get associate pastors. So they're going to have a UCC, either a senior pastor or an associate. That person can do weddings. My question, though, is, if the property's in the Methodist name, technically you can't do them in the church. Who gets to say? The bishop. And if you get brought up on charges, it could go to a church trial. Then 13 of your peers are going to get to say, right? So until the Methodist Church changes, you're exactly right. Many pastors have done weddings. I think the question is, does somebody know you did the wedding and did they turn you in? Some pastors deliberately turn themselves in because they're trying to really make a statement, right? But I can assure you, many pastors have done weddings. So each of us has to deal with our own conscience about that, right? Did I see a hand? We've raised a lot of good questions, and I encourage you to come next week. Shannon Fleck is wonderful. We know Paul is wonderful. Let's ask them about the disciples, and then we're going to kind of discern where to go next. But after that, I'm going to kind of return us to a space for grace, worshipful atmosphere, okay? So that's going to happen in 2 weeks, all right? Let's just end, because I know we've gone over, and I've seen choir members come in. So let me pray for us. Gracious God, we lift up the names of people who are on our hearts and minds, people who are either sick or jobless or struggling in any way. We lift up our healthcare workers, we lift up our teachers and all the parents and grandparents and grown-ups and all of our students. We continue to pray for our church as we discern and have these hard decisions to face. We lift up our own needs to you. And we echo the prayer of Jesus when he taught us to pray, when he said, Our Father, who art in heaven, y'all have a great week.